Think you know daily life in ancient Egypt, the pyramids and pharaohs version. Most people picture a world split neatly into glamorous royalty and miserable slaves, with everyone else sort of fading into the background like an extra in a Sandal movie. But the truth is stranger, warmer, and honestly more familiar. For most Egyptians, the great drama of life wasn't a royal intrigue. It was whether the Nile flooded on time, whether the bread rose, and whether the beer turned out drinkable instead of, aggressively educational. And here's the part that usually surprises people. Some of the best documented Egyptians we know by name weren't kings. They were working-class artisans paid in food, who lived in a purpose-built village and filed complaints when their wages were late. One of those complaints became, very likely, the first recorded labor strike in history. Ancient Egypt, land of eternal monuments and extremely relatable workplace issues. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Drop a comment with your time and location. It's genuinely fascinating to see this little community spread across the globe, all tuning in from different nights, different mornings, different corners of the map. Tonight, our story is a slow walk through ordinary Egyptian hours, the kind that repeated for thousands of years. We'll step into a mud brick house before sunrise, feel flour dust in the air, taste the sharpness of onions and beer, and follow a family through work, gossip, games, and festivals. And later, we'll visit that workers' village near the Valley of the Kings, where the paperwork was so detailed that an argument about missing grain can still echo across 3 millennia with the energy of a modern customer service email. The backbone of Egypt was never stone. It was mud, water, and routine. Year after year, the Nile rose and spread itself across the floodplain, leaving behind a skin of dark, fertile silt. To outsiders, it could look like magic. To Egyptians, it was the center of the calendar, so dependable that time itself was organized around it. They divided the year into 3 seasons. Akhet, the inundation, when fields disappeared underwater. Pere, the growing season, when green returned in careful rows. And Shemu, the harvest, when the air filled with chaff and the scratchy music of sickles. If you lived in a farming village, the Nile didn't just water your crops. It decided your mood, your workload, your taxes, and sometimes whether your neighbors would be smiling at a festival or staring silently at an empty storage jar. Picture a morning in Pere, the season when the flood has retreated and the ground is soft, enriched, and ready. Dawn arrives quickly. The light is pale at first, then suddenly sharp, spilling over flat roofs and courtyards. In a modest house made of mud brick, the walls are thick enough to keep a little coolness from the night. The floor is covered with reed mats that scratch softly under bare feet. The house isn't enormous. Most households were basically a family unit, a few rooms around a central space, practical and close. There's a sense of everything having a place because if you don't organize, the sand and dust will happily do it for you, and it won't choose your preferred system. In the kitchen area, often with an opening above for ventilation, someone is already grinding grain. This is not a cute, occasional rustic hobby. It's serious, repetitive labor. A stone quern, a handstone moving back and forth, turning emmer wheat or barley into flour. The sound is steady, a gritty hush. It can take hours, and it leaves its mark on the body over years, especially on knees and backs. Archaeologists can sometimes see that wear in skeletons, a quiet reminder that daily bread was not a metaphor. The flour becomes dough. Bread in Egypt was not one single standardized loaf. It could be flat, domed, shaped, sometimes baked in clay ovens, sometimes pressed into molds. It could be coarse, speckled with bits of husk, dense enough to convince you that chewing is a character-building exercise. But it was food, and it was life, and it sat at the center of almost every meal. And then, right beside bread, there was beer. Not the cold, fizzy kind you open at a barbecue. Egyptian beer was often made by partially baking barley bread, crumbling it into water, and letting it ferment. It was nutritious, sometimes thick, mildly alcoholic, and in a world where water could be risky depending on source and season, fermentation was a kind of everyday safety technology. This meant beer wasn't just for parties. It was for lunch. It was for wages. It was, in many households, the dependable beverage that turned up like a punctual friend. Outside the village is waking. You might hear a donkey bray, the shuffle of sandals on packed earth, voices rising and falling in that morning tone that is half greeting, half inventory of what hurts today. Clothing is linen because linen makes sense. Flax grows well. Linen breathes. And in Egypt's heat, heavy fabric is a bad decision with consequences. Men often wore a simple kilt or loincloth. Women often wore sheath dresses with straps. The better your status, the finer and more abundant the linen, and the more time you can spend making it look effortlessly elegant instead of, I dressed in the dark because the goat escaped again. Children, especially younger ones, often went without clothing until around the age of 12. It's practical, it saves textile resources, and it probably reduces laundry arguments. Childhood still had chores, though. Small hands can carry small jars. They can chase birds away from seeds. They can learn the basic truth of farming everywhere. The field does not care about your feelings. Now, if you're imagining the whole country as farmers in identical huts, here's where Egypt gets interesting. It was agricultural at its core, but layered with specialists: potters, weavers, carpenters, metalworkers, priests, soldiers, and scribes. And scribes, in particular, were the people who made society legible to itself. Literacy was rare. Writing took training. A scribe wasn't just someone with neat handwriting. He was the bridge between grain in a jar and grain on a tax record. He was the one who turned harvest into numbers and numbers into obligations, which is a polite way of saying, if you saw a scribe coming, you might suddenly remember something urgent you had to do in the opposite direction. But here's the part that will surprise you, and it's worth holding on to as we keep walking. The same society that could carve colossal temples also ran on very ordinary logistics: food rations, work schedules, days off, complaints, sick leave, personal letters, divorce arrangements. It's all there, sometimes preserved on papyrus, sometimes scribbled on ostraca, pottery shards and limestone flakes used like notepads. Ancient Egypt, it turns out, had receipts. And that's how we can get so close to daily life that it almost feels like eavesdropping. Let's stay with that farming village for a while longer. Work in the fields depended on season. In Pare, planting and tending dominated. The soil, still moist from the flood, could be turned with simple plows, often pulled by oxen. Seeds were scattered, then sometimes trodden in by animals. Irrigation channels needed attention. Water had to be coaxed and carried. And in later periods, a device called the shadoof, a counterweighted lever with a bucket, helped lift water from canals to higher ground. It's an elegantly simple machine. A long pole balanced on a frame, weight on one end, bucket on the other, human muscle in the middle. The bucket dips, fills, rises, pours, repeats. Methodical, almost hypnotic, if your shoulders aren't the ones doing it. By midday, the sun presses down with authority. Many people worked early, paused in the hottest hours, then returned later. Shade becomes valuable. A wall's shadow is a small luxury. The air smells like warm earth, plant sap, and the faint sweetness of ripening dates if palms are nearby. Meals were usually simple and often eaten with the hands. Bread, beer, vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, chickpeas, lettuce, cucumbers. Onions and garlic show up so often that you begin to suspect Egypt ran on them the way some modern offices run on coffee. Fruit could include dates, figs, grapes, pomegranates. Honey existed, but for most people it was a treat, not a daily assumption. Fish from the Nile mattered too. It was a reliable protein source, caught, dried, salted. Meat from cattle, goats, sheep, pigs, and poultry existed, but for many ordinary families it showed up most often on feast days. The smell of roasting meat in that context wasn't just appetizing. It was an announcement. Today is different. Today is a festival. Today the world has cracked open and offered something extra. Home life, meanwhile, carried on in parallel with field work. Someone patches a basket, coils rope, repairs a tool handle. Ceramics are everywhere. Jars for grain, oil, water, beer. Pottery is the quiet infrastructure of domestic life, the kind of thing you only notice when it breaks, which it does, regularly, because gravity has always been confident. Inside the house, walls might be whitewashed, brightening the interior. Wealthier homes could add dyed linen hangings for color. Furniture ranged from simple stools and low tables to more elaborate pieces for the elite, sometimes inlaid with ivory or precious woods. Beds were often raised off the ground, a practical choice to improve airflow and avoid insects. Even in the simplest home, you can feel the same universal logic. Keep your sleeping surface away from whatever is crawling. Cleanliness mattered more than people often assume. Egyptians valued hygiene for practical and ritual reasons. Bathing in the Nile was common. Soap-like pastes could be made from animal fat and chalk. Grooming could be surprisingly intense. Men often shaved, sometimes the whole body, using copper or bronze razors, partly to avoid lice, and partly as a cultural preference for cleanliness. If you're thinking, that sounds like a lot of upkeep. Yes. The ancient world asked for many things, and one of them was apparently a commitment to hair removal, and then there's cosmetics. Both men and women used eye makeup, kohl made from minerals like galena for black and malachite for green. It looked striking, but it also helped with glare and may have offered some protection against infection. In a bright, dusty environment, lining your eyes isn't only fashion, it's also, in a way, equipment. Perfumed oils and ointments were used as well. Egypt was hot. Bodies sweat. Work is physical. A little fragrance isn't vanity. It's social diplomacy. Now, at around the point in the day when the sun begins to lean and the worst heat loosens its grip, you might hear laughter from a street corner, the clack of game pieces, the thump of a ball. Leisure existed. Not endless leisure, not the modern weekend concept, but the human urge to play showed up anyway, like a plant pushing through a crack in stone. Senet was one of the most popular board games. It used a board of 30 squares and pieces moved by chance devices, likely throwing sticks or knuckle bones. It was played by ordinary people and by royalty, and by the new kingdom it carried religious meaning, tied to the soul's journey through the afterlife. It's a wonderful Egyptian idea, really. Even your board game can be metaphysical. Other games existed too, like Mayhem, played on a board shaped like a coiled snake, and a game we call Hounds and Jackals, or 58 Holes, known especially from the Middle Kingdom, with pegged pieces often carved with animal heads. We don't have the full rules written down, which means every modern reconstruction includes a bit of educated guesswork and a lot of optimism. But the fact that these boards were made, kept and placed in tombs tells you they mattered. Children played with dolls, animal figures, balls made of leather or papyrus, pull toys with moving parts. There was even a clever Middle Kingdom pull toy, often described as a figure kneading dough or grinding grain. You pull the string and the little worker bends and moves, doing in miniature what the household does in real life. It's adorable and also slightly ominous, like a toddler receiving a tiny spreadsheet and being told, "Start early." Did you know some Egyptian toys included simple mechanical tricks? A toy dog from the New Kingdom used a lever mechanism so that pressing it could move the dog forward. It's not industrial engineering, but it is evidence of playful minds enjoying cause and effect. And if you're ever tempted by wild claims that a particular wooden bird proves Egyptians invented airplanes, you're thinking of the so-called Saqqara bird, dated around 200 BCE. Modern testing suggests it wasn't a functional glider. It was more likely a toy or a weather vane. Still interesting, just not an ancient aviation program. As evening arrives, work winds down. The main meal is eaten later in the day, after labor is done. A family gathers, bread broken, vegetables shared, perhaps fish if it's available, beer poured into cups or small jars. The light inside is softer, oil lamps exist, but fuel is valuable, so darkness is treated with respect. Conversation rises, then settles. Storytelling appears, because it costs nothing and gives everything. Egypt had formal literature, but it also had a strong oral tradition. Stories about gods, legendary kings, moral fables, and clever commoners traveled from mouth to mouth, village to village. Even a pharaoh in a palace could be entertained by tales, as in the stories preserved in the Westcar papyrus, where King Khufu hears stories of wonders. That should comfort anyone who has ever watched a powerful person relax by listening to a good narrative. Some habits are eternal. Now, you might be thinking the rhythm we've described sounds stable, even soothing. Nile floods, planting, harvest, family meals, games, stories. You'd be right. But ancient Egypt also had a more structured, almost bureaucratic version of daily life in certain places, where work was specialized and recorded in astonishing detail. And that brings us to Deir el-Medina. On the west bank near Thebes, not far from the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, there was a purpose-built village for the artisans who cut and decorated royal tombs during the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE. This wasn't a random sprawl of houses. It was a planned community, and it produced one of the richest archives of everyday documents from the ancient world. At its peak, the workforce was about 120 men, organized into two crews, often referred to as left and right. Add families, and the community may have numbered around 500 to 600 people. They lived in compact mud brick houses, close together, with the desert hills rising around them. The air out there is dry, the colors sharp, pale stone, tawny sand, the occasional stubborn green in small gardens. Their work was prestigious in a sense because they served the king's eternal project, preparing the tomb that would link Pharaoh to the gods. But it was also work. It involved cutting stone, hauling materials, grinding pigments, mixing plaster, painting, carving, and enduring the fine dust that settles into everything, including lungs. They had schedules. Records suggest an 8-day work week with 1 day off, plus many religious holidays. Imagine explaining that calendar at a modern office. So we work 8 days, then take 1 off, but also the gods need us to rest frequently, and yes, that's non-negotiable. Honestly, it's not the worst policy. They were paid in rations, grain, fish, vegetables, oil, sometimes beer, and occasionally meat. Their scribes kept track of distributions, attendance, and disputes. If someone was absent, A reason might be recorded. Illness, family matters, even something like brewing beer could show up. It's both intimate and extremely human. The ancient equivalent of marking your calendar as out of office. This is where we meet. Around the 10-minute point in our stroll, a secondary character type who always makes history feel alive. The troublemaker whose neighbors could not stop writing about him. One of the most famous is a workman named Paneb, known from documents including Papyrus Salt 124, where he was accused of a long list of misdeeds by another workman, Amanakta. The accusations include theft, violence, and various abuses of authority. Now we should be careful here. Accusations are not the same as verdicts, and community politics can be sharp. But the very existence of this complaint file tells you something deliciously ordinary. Even in a village dedicated to the sacred work of royal tombs, people argued, kept grudges, and made formal reports. If you squint, you can almost see the scene. A scribe leaning over an ostrakhan, scratching down the details while someone vents in the background, fueled by equal parts righteous anger and the certainty that everyone else is going to hear about this. Deir el-Medina documents cover marriage arrangements, property issues, loans, inheritance, quarrels, and apologies. Divorce was possible, and often relatively straightforward compared to what many people imagine about ancient societies. Marriage itself didn't necessarily require a grand religious ceremony. In many cases, a couple simply began living together and were recognized as married. Families there looked like families everywhere. Parents trying to manage resources, children growing fast, neighbors in each other's business because walls are thin and life is shared. Houses had central living areas, storage spaces, sleeping areas. On the roof, you might dry food, repair nets, catch a faint breeze at night. And here's another moment that tends to flip modern assumptions, so let's treat it as our mid-episode twist. The famous Egyptian look, the eyeliner, the perfumes, the wigs, the shaved heads, was not just elite extravagance. It was part fashion, part hygiene, part environmental adaptation, and it reached beyond palaces. Upper-class men and women wore wigs, sometimes made from human hair or plant fibers, partly for style and status, partly for sun protection. Natural hair beneath might be shaved or kept short. Children, when they reached maturity around 12, entered adulthood with rituals. Boys might undergo circumcision and have their heads shaved. It's a dramatic way to mark a transition, and also a practical one, signaling a new social identity. And yes, beer again. It wasn't just a drink, it was a unit of value. Rations often included it. Workers could receive beer as part of pay. When you read that and think, so wages were basically carbs and beer, you're not wrong. It's just that in a world without supermarkets, that was exactly what you needed. If you want to understand ancient Egypt without getting lost in gold and mystery, follow the bread. Flour ground on stone, dough mixed by hand, loaves baked in clay ovens, grain measured, stored, recorded. Grain turned into beer, grain turned into wages, grain turned into taxes, grain turned into offerings for the gods and the dead. Festivals punctuated the year and broke the routine in the best way. In Thebes, the Opet festival involved a grand procession of the statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu from Karnak to Luxor Temple, with music, dancing, feasting, and crowds. The beautiful festival of the valley brought families to the tombs of their ancestors with food and drink, connecting living and dead in a shared meal. These weren't quiet private moments. They were communal, bright with movement, full of noise and fragrance, and the heavy sweetness of extra beer rations. Music was part of these gatherings. Harps, flutes, drums, lutes, and the sistrum, a rattle associated with Hathor and Isis, used in ritual to please the goddesses and ward off harmful forces. Tomb paintings show musicians, sometimes blind harpists, suggesting traditions and social roles that still raise questions today. And dance, too. Solemn dances for ritual, energetic acrobatics for entertainment, mourning dances for funerals. It's a reminder that Egyptians did not experience religion as purely abstract. It was embodied. It was sung and shaken in the hand as a sistrum. It was danced into the dust. All of this can feel like a steady, almost eternal world. But even steady worlds have pressure points. At Deir el-Medina, the pressure point was the ration system. When you pay people in grain and the grain doesn't arrive, you don't just have an accounting error. You have hunger. You have household stress. You have children asking questions that adults don't want to answer. By the late New Kingdom, Egypt faced strains. Expensive building projects, international pressures, internal complexity. During the reign of Ramesses III, who ruled roughly 1186 to 1155 BCE, the state still projected power, but the machinery behind the scenes could creak. Officials could be late. Supplies could be delayed. Promises could sit on paper instead of in jars. And this is where we approach the moment that turns daily life into something with a sharp edge. The workmen of Deir el-Medina were responsible for the royal tombs. Their labor was sacred and state-supported. They were not anonymous slaves toiling without record. They were skilled artisans with an identity, organized in crews, overseen by foremen and scribes, paid in regular rations. So imagine the situation when those rations stopped arriving on time. At first, it might have been a day late. Annoying, but perhaps explainable. Then later still. The kind of delay that forces you to borrow from neighbors, stretch bread thinner, turn dinner into a quiet negotiation. The kind of delay that makes the village feel tense in the evening, voices lower, laughter rarer. You can almost hear the murmurs on the path to work. Did your grain come? No. Mine neither. They say tomorrow. Tomorrow is the most dangerous word in a ration economy. By about the 20th minute point in our story, the tension is no longer background, it's the main subject. Because the workers did something that feels startlingly modern. They stopped working. In what is often described as the first recorded labor strike, documented in sources including the Turin Strike Papyrus, the Deir el-Medina workforce in year 29 of Ramesses III walked off the job to protest late payments. They didn't do it with violence. They did it by refusing to continue and by making their need visible. They left the work site and sat in places that mattered, including temples and public areas, essentially staging a kind of organized ancient sit-in. Their message, preserved through the scribal habit of writing everything down, was blunt and practical. They were hungry, and the system had failed. If you want to try a modern comparison, imagine a highly specialized team working on the most important national project of the year. And instead of salaries, they're paid in food deliveries. Then the deliveries stop. Their kids are hungry. Their pantry is empty. And management responds with, "We're looking into it." You can see how this ends. And of course, officials tried to manage it the way officials often do, which is to hope the problem will become less real if everyone speaks politely about it. But hunger does not respond to polite language. At first, there were attempts to patch the situation, to offer partial payments, to make assurances, yet the workers' refusal forced the issue into the open. This wasn't just one household complaining. It was the organized labor force that built the king's eternity, saying, in effect, "We cannot decorate immortality on an empty stomach." The irony is almost too perfect. A civilization famous for its timeless monuments confronted a very non-timeless problem: logistics. For the workers, the strike wasn't ideology. It was dinner, and it worked. The resolution, like many satisfying historical resolutions, was not a thunderclap. It was the sound of jars being filled. Authorities responded by arranging the overdue rations. Grain was distributed, supplies were pulled from granaries, payments were made, and the immediate crisis eased. The workers returned to their tasks because the work mattered, and because stability had been restored in the most practical way possible. Bread and beer showed up again. It's tempting to imagine celebrations, and perhaps there were moments of relief. The kind where shoulders drop and someone laughs too loudly because the tension has finally released. But the deeper victory was quieter. The record shows that these workmen knew their value, knew the terms of their labor, and understood how to apply collective pressure in a system that depended on them. And this is where our opening promise pays off. Daily life in Egypt wasn't just passive routine under divine kingship. It included negotiation. It included complaint. It included the expectation that a contract, even one written in grain, mattered. When people say the pyramids were built by slaves, they're flattening a complicated history. Labor in Egypt took many forms, and there were enslaved people in certain contexts, especially in later periods and through warfare. But large state projects often relied on taxed labor, corvée service, and paid workforces who received rations. At Deir el-Medina, we can see a workforce that was housed, organized, paid, and recorded, and that could even withdraw labor when the payment system failed. If you step back, the strike also fits perfectly into the Egyptian worldview of balance, of ma'at, the idea of order and rightness. A ration system that doesn't feed workers is disorder. The solution wasn't dramatic punishment or grand speeches. It was restoring balance in the most literal way, restoring the flow of grain. And once the jars were filled again, the familiar rhythms returned. A morning begins with grinding grain, the stone moving back and forth. Bread bakes in a clay oven, the smell warm and steady. Linen is shaken out, white in the sun. A little coal is applied at the eye, dark against skin, reducing glare. Tools are lifted, handles worn smooth by hands that have done this 1,000 times. In the village, someone argues about a boundary line. Someone borrows oil. Someone promises to repay after the next distribution. Children pull a toy along the dirt, the string taut in small fingers. Somewhere, a board game waits, pieces lined up, chance and strategy ready to pass the afternoon. In the evening, stories return, because stories always return. Tales of gods and kings, yes, but also tales of ordinary cleverness, the kind that keeps households going. The world narrows to lamplight and voices, to the taste of bread and the comfort of predictable hours. And that might be the most grounding thing about ancient Egypt. The pyramids are astonishing. The tomb paintings are luminous. But the civilization endured because millions of people did the same small tasks, day after day, season after season, and because they found ways to make those days not only survivable, but social, playful, and sometimes, when necessary, fiercely organized. Thanks for spending this time in the ordinary streets and rooms of ancient Egypt, where the real wonders are often a loaf of bread, a jar of beer, and a community that knows how to insist on being fed. And if you haven't yet, I still love hearing where this episode finds you. Drop a comment with your time and location, and let's see how far these ancient evenings have traveled.